Good morning. Are you all sleeping still? Good morning. On behalf of Florida Atlantic University's Board of Trustees, our President, Dr. John Kelly, our Executive Leadership Team, and the Diversity Platform Council, I would like to officially welcome you to the 2018 Diversity Symposium for Faculty and Staff. I'm Dr. Andrea Guzman Oliver, Associate Vice President for Student Outreach and Diversity, and I have the honor of chairing the University Diversity Platform. I will also be serving today as your MC. We often describe Florida Atlantic University as one of the most ethnically diverse institutions in the nation, and the most diverse in the Florida State University system. We also describe ourselves as minority serving, and most recently, a Hispanic serving institution. But what exactly does this mean? Typically, such rankings are associated with enrollment numbers. In order to be considered Hispanic serving, for instance, we must demonstrate that our institution enrolls at least 25% or more of students who identify as Hispanic or Latinx. But again, I ask, what exactly does this mean? Does it mean that we simply enroll a high number of ethnically diverse students? Or does it mean that we strive to serve them? Does it mean that only our students are diverse? Or does it mean that we seek to diversify our faculty, staff, leadership, and organization? The responses to these questions can be found in Florida Atlantic University's strategic plan, A Race to Excellence. The strategic plan to A Race of Excellence outlines the university's pillars and platforms. One of those platforms is diversity. Within this platform, we are tasked with the following: to identify and promote opportunities to diversify our students, faculty, and staff, and to build institutional cross-cultural competencies. To cultivate a community in which individuals demonstrate respect toward one another. To facilitate campus efforts to increase partnerships, retention and success of all students, faculty, and staff from historically underrepresented groups. To provide effective awareness and enrichment programs to the FAU community, and to develop a campus-wide approach to ensure that students, faculty, and staff learn and work within a campus defined by best practices in equity, diversity, and inclusion. In essence, we are striving to be the national model of diversity, not just of our student body, but as an institution. To that end, a council comprised of primarily faculty with some staff was assembled utilizing input from our deans. Can the members of the Diversity Platform Council who are present please stand? Dr. Salinas is involved in so much, he's like, wait a second, am I part of the council or not? Yes, you are. No trying to run away. It is the work of this council that has led us here and to many other diversity programs and sponsorships. Thank you for your hard work and dedication to fulfilling our institutional goals for diversity. Today's symposium is divided into 5 sections: the opening plenary and panel discussion, morning breakout sessions, a lunch and keynote, afternoon breakout sessions, and a mix and mingle where students have been invited. We invite you to attend as many of these sessions as you like. Registration will be open and available on site 15 minutes prior to the start of each session if you're not already registered. The session descriptions are available in your folders. Our opening plenary is sponsored in part by the Hispanic Serving Institution Research Interest Group and is titled Understanding Hispanic Serving Institutions. The opening plenary remarks will be provided by Dr. Gina Garcia from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Gina Garcia is an assistant professor in the Department of Administrative and Policy Studies, where she teaches master's and doctoral students pursuing degrees in higher education and student affairs. She received her PhD in higher education and organizational change from the University of California, Los Angeles, Her dissertation titled Challenging the Manufactured Identity of Hispanic Serving Institutions, Co-Constructing an Organizational Identity, looked at the organizational identity of HSIs and ways in which this identity goes beyond the label assigned by the federal government and becomes more deeply rooted in the culture and practice of the institution. Her research interests center on issues of equity and diversity within higher education, with an emphasis on the organizational culture and identity of Hispanic serving institutions and the retention, success, and identity development of Latinx students. Dr. Gina Garcia joins us today to provide data-informed insight on what it truly means to be a Hispanic serving institution and to challenge us to go beyond the definition provided by the federal government. Without further ado, Dr. Gina Garcia.
Good morning, everybody. I apologize. I had lots of flight trouble, so I made it just in time, and I'm happy to be here. Although I wish I would have heard the opening remarks so I know what you were talking about, so I could make sure I could fit this in. But I think I have a general idea. So, do I have 15 minutes? Okay. I'm gonna time myself because I could talk all day about Hispanic serving institutions. So, thank you all. I'm excited to have you all here. I'm excited to talk to you all a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing, working, with Hispanic serving institutions and really starting to think about what it means to be an HSI or Latinx serving or Latino, Latina serving or Hispanic serving or however you want to refer to it, which I know is the next session, right? Like names and labeling is an important thing. But for me, it's really a conceptual thing, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what that means conceptually for your institution to become an HSI, right? And I say become because HSIs all become rather than actually be, right? It's a progression and it's constantly moving, and I think about it as really fluid. So that's one thing I hope y'all take away from the next 10 to 15 minutes is that this is fluid, right? So don't think it's fixed. Don't think of HSI as being one thing. It's multifaceted and complex. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I think some of y'all are working on this specifically and thinking really intentionally about what it means to be a Hispanic serving institution. But for those of you that are just starting to become aware of what this is or what it means, just a quick little overview. I think y'all know it means that you enroll at least 25% or more Hispanic or Latino students. But basically, we all know that once you hit that point, we don't really know what else, right? Like, okay, we enroll a lot of students, but what else does it mean, right? Which is where my work really comes in to think about conceptually. But the important thing is that the HSIs are growing in number, right? And so that's what this map represents, is that they are increasing tremendously. Right? And so the fact that we're thinking about this at multiple levels, like the federal government is thinking about it, institutions are thinking about it, I'm thinking about it, other scholars are thinking about it, practitioners are thinking about it. We have whole conferences dedicated to HSIs. If you're not going to the Alliance of HSI Educators in Chicago in March, go. That conference is completely dedicated just to thinking about what it means to be an HSI. So there's entire bodies of folks that are thinking about what this means because we're growing in numbers, right? Currently represent about 14% of all post-secondary institutions. But since I started studying HSIs, it's gone up about 1% every year. And when I started, it was about 6% of all post-secondary institutions. So, and now it's 14%. So I usually call all institutions that aren't HSIs, I call them gonna be HSIs. Because pretty much a lot of institutions are gonna be HSIs, right? And we know that because these are enrollment-driven institutions, and we know what the Latino population in the US looks like. It's growing faster than any other population, and is going to continue to grow, even if the current president builds a wall, builds a fort, builds a whatever, because we are reproducing. We're not coming here, right? Like, we're just reproducing, we're here already, we're reproducing. So the population isn't going anywhere, right? The population is going to continue to increase. So for y'all to think about it now, the post-secondary institutions, thinking about it now is smart, right? That's a smart, effective way to think about how to be effective, right? So just to think a little bit about HSI. So I always rework the slide, like when I do presentations and rework my Prezi, I continue to rework the slide, and I wanted to really point out Because as I thought about your institution, I wanted to point out that HSIs are super diverse, right? There's a lot of, we talk about diversity, institutional, or student level diversity. HSIs represent institutional level diversity, right? Which is the really cool thing, right? That post-secondary institutions are so super diverse, and HSIs represent all of that diversity, right? So the only thing that brings us together, HSIs together, is the 25%, and also the nonprofit status. That I chose to put there because that's important, right? Because for-profit institutions currently do not qualify to be federally designated as HSIs. And I say currently because I worry about the current administration. So let's hope that remains that way, because it would become super complex if for-profits become HSIs. That's a whole other talk. But for now, nonprofit and enrollment, right? Those are the only things that unite these institutions. Otherwise, nothing unites them, right? And again, I think that's important to think about, that like rather than thinking about, I spend a lot of time with HSIs, and HSIs seem to want to just the formula. What's the formula? Dr. Garcia, give us the checklist. We want the 10 things we got to do. And there's no checklist. There's no 10 things. There's nothing. There's no one to emulate except yourselves, right? So it's such a great opportunity to think for yourselves, what does it mean for you based on your characteristics, right? Because they're so diverse. They're 2-year, they're 4-year, they're public, they're private, they're big, they're small. I spent a lot of time in small. I've been spending a lot of time in small HSIs. And I had previously spent a lot of time in big HSIs, like enrolling 30,000 or more. I've been spending time with institutions that enroll 1,200 students, right? And they operate very differently. They become HSIs very, very differently, and they have very hands-on sort of things that a big university that enrolls 30,000 students can't do what one that enrolls 1,200 can do, right? So you cannot compare yourself. And so I thought this picture was appropriate. And this was something I hadn't had on one of my Prezi slides, but I'm like, you know what? Like, we've got to think about it like that. That like there's so much diversity, right? And there's so much that all HSIs look different. And it's okay if y'all are the orange or the apple or the grapes or the pineapple or the guava or whatever you want to be. You don't have to look like the other HSIs, right? That's okay, right? I also think it's interesting to think about language. Right, like I submitted a proposal one time to a conference, and I talked about Naranja State University and Manzana. And the reviewer said, well, maybe Naranja State University isn't Naranja yet. Maybe it's still an orange, right? And maybe it's going to be Naranja eventually, right? And that was so fascinating. I love that, right? Like, okay, yeah, right? Like there's this progression, right? And maybe you're an orange, and you're going to progress and become a Naranja eventually. Right? So I like the idea of fruits, and that's the name of an institution in one of my studies. So I put the profile of students at HSIs, although in thinking about the diversity, this profile doesn't fit students at all HSIs. And I want to think a little bit about your students and how they do fit this or don't. This is sort of a general profile of students at HSIs, right? They tend to be first generation, they tend to be lower income, they tend to be maybe immigrant students. A lot of HSIs are trying to serve undocumented students. And there's some general, right? Some general things. But there's also some not general, right? And your institution, as I look at your characteristics, don't necessarily fit all of these things. They fit some of them, but they don't fit all of them, right? And I'm gonna get into your institutional characteristics and how your institutional characteristics are the reason why your student characteristics don't completely match this, right? Because the institutional characteristics determine the student characteristics, right? And we know that. We know how admissions work, right? So there's some just general profile of students. I added also this idea of profile of faculty. A good friend of mine wrote this chapter in a book, an HSI book. There's several edited books about HSIs. If you don't have them, get them. This is from the edited book by Dr. Anne-Marie Nunez and Dr. Sylvia Hurtado, Dr. Emily Calderon. And they have an edited book that several of us contributed chapters to, and this chapter outlines faculty diversity at HSIs. And in the chapter, basically, Dr. Gonzalez lays out how faculty don't match the student profile, right? And that's important, all right? Because every time I go to talk to campuses, that becomes a conversation. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that and like why it matters that the faculty and the staff need to match. In one of my current, like an article that's about to be published, I also start to highlight how your graduate student population doesn't match your undergraduate population. and I have data to show that at multiple institutions, that the undergraduate population might be 35% Latinx and only like 14% of the graduate population is. That matters for a graduate institution. That matters for a research university. All right, so that's something for y'all to think about as well, and I highlight that here. So what does it mean to be an HSI, or what does it mean to serve Latinx students? That's the question. Basically, if you could answer this question, you could win $1 million. And so I've been trying to answer the question and been trying to win $1 million, but I haven't won $1 million yet. But I do get to come to universities and talk to y'all and get y'all to think a little bit about what it might mean, right? Because that's the question. What does it actually mean? And so I have done a lot of review of literature. There's lots of empirical articles. All right, so if you want to learn more about HSIs, a lot of people have written about HSIs. And so there's a lot of empirical articles. And basically what I talk about is that what I gather from the articles is there's two large categories. So people either define an HSI based on outcomes, meaning graduation rates, or they base it on like the culture, right? So this is outcomes. These are some of the articles that have been written that sort of define HSI. Like if you graduate students in equitable numbers, you're an HSI, right? And so I challenge that a little because it's complicated. Whether or not you graduate students is based on your institutional characteristics and based on the incoming characteristics of your students, right? So if you're letting in a highly selective body of students, you're gonna probably graduate them more at higher numbers than a broad access institution, right? So that matters. So I talk a lot about that. It's like, do we want to judge broad access institutions and compare them to more selective institutions, right? And is that really fair? And is that really fair to compare community colleges to broad access four-year institutions to more selective research universities, which is where we're seeing a lot of growth for emerging HSIs is at the research level, right? So that's some of the outcomes data. And then a lot of articles have written about the culture. That like students feel like they belong, there's a greater sense of belonging, they can talk to faculty and staff in Spanish or in languages they feel comfortable, they can talk to other students more comfortably, they see students like them, the culture feels good, right? And so I talk about that, like, well, which is more important? That you have a good culture, you have good outcomes, right? Or do you need both, right? And so I present this model. I'm going to talk a little bit more for those of you who come into the workshop that I'm going to present. I'll talk a little bit more about the model, but I talk about how, well, maybe there's different ways, right? And maybe, again, this is progression. So you might start as Hispanic enrolling and you just have a good large percentage of Latinx students, but you move into having a better culture at some point. Or maybe that's the direction you want to go. Maybe you do a campus climate survey and your students say, you know what? The climate here is bad. There's a lot of racism here, and I experienced microaggressions in the classroom. So your culture maybe isn't where you're at, but your outcomes are good. And that happens a lot. It's one or the other in a lot of cases, from what I've seen. So maybe you're graduating students, and I'm going to show you the numbers. You're doing a pretty good job. Graduating students in good numbers and in equitable numbers, but you got to start to think about, well, what does it feel like to be here? Right? Does it feel? Because students, they're like, yeah, I'm going to graduate because I came in and I went to a good high school and I had high SAT scores. I'm going to graduate whether it's good or not. But I want it to be good. I want to have a good experience when I'm in college, right? So that's what I sort of challenge people to think about. And then I have over here what's missing. These are the big things that I've been talking to campuses about lately is faculty diversity, how do you get there? Graduate student diversity and staff, right? And all of these numbers are way behind the student numbers. Right? So your undergraduate population grows, but none of the other populations do. So there needs to be some more intentionality in that, and that's not captured in the typology. So I gotta figure that out. That's like a couple articles down the line. It's like, how do I get that in there? Right? I mean, that's all compositional diversity, but it's not necessarily represented in a way that I talk, specifically about it. So finally, I think I'm running out of time here, and I'm gonna let y'all ask some questions. As I started thinking about this talk and got into your data and I always go to institutional research data, always, and spend time just getting to know the numbers. Here's some couple things I thought about. So I thought about the characteristics of the institution, right? Because like I said, you cannot compare yourself to other institutions. So when you start to think about finding a model, because that seems to be the thing that folks do at HSIs, is like, we want to find a model. We want to do what somebody else that already knows what they're doing is doing. Nobody knows what they're doing, so do you, right? But if you're going to look at somebody that looks like you, right? Look for a research university, look for a university that has, fairly stringent admission pattern. I don't know that y'all are the most selective institution, but, looking at the numbers and SAT and what the average SAT and stuff, it looks like you're admitting a population that they had to be a little bit more competitive. So think about those sort of things, right? A good comparison, I think, for universities that are research universities right now are the UCs. So the University of California, I've spent time with them. I'm from California. I know the University of California system really well. And there's 10 campuses in the UC system, and I think there are now 5 or 6 HSIs. Might be 7. It's a moving target. They're moving, and they're moving quickly. They want to be HSIs. They are like, we're going to be HSIs, right? There's no reason why all the institutions in California shouldn't be HSIs. If they aren't, they're keeping their students out. UCLA isn't an HSI because it's keeping students out. It's surrounded by Latino students, everywhere, right? Like, it's real easy to be a brown institution when you're in the middle of LA, but they're not. So they're close, but they're not, right? And UC Berkeley also isn't. So the most selective UCs are not yet, but the rest of them are like, yeah, we want to be an HSI. What does that mean? And come help us, right? So if you want to start to compare yourself to other research universities, think about that. University of Texas, San Antonio, they're also an interesting case, and they're also a research university, and they're striving to be more of a research university and struggling with what that means to also be an HSI, right? So you're going to start to experience tensions between what it means to be a good research university, a tier 1 university, as UTSA calls themselves, and also serving Latino students, low-income students, undocumented students, students who are minoritized. How do you do both? Right, and there's articles being written about the tensions, right? Particularly with UTSA. I like reading articles written about UTSA because I don't know that there needs to be a tension, right? Like, why can't we be both, right? Why can't we be excellent and serve minoritized students, right? That's the goal. That's the goal for HSIs, I think, right? Like, be both, right? If you can. So think about your characteristics. There's some of your numbers. The population, your white population is a little less than 50%, your student population, but your faculty is like almost 70%, right? Like, it's fairly high. And I only looked at faculty, and there were a lot of different breakdowns. Anybody from institutional research in here? No, where are your IR people? Your IR people, that's something I'm gonna put out there. IR people need to be engaged in this conversation because your IR people can give you like disaggregated numbers. They will tell you where Latino students are. They'll be like, guess what? They're all in nursing. Guess where they're not at? Engineering. Why aren't they in the engineering, but they're in nursing? Why are they in sociology, but not in mechanical engineering? Why aren't they in biology? Why aren't they in chemistry? Why aren't they there? Why are they here? Right? Because your numbers will be skewed for sure, right? So think about that, like, where are your IR people? Because I like IR data, and I see there's a lot of number breakdowns on the IR website for the Latinx student population. But you want to get really disaggregated numbers so you understand where are you doing a good job and where aren't you, right? And disaggregated numbers will give you that. Think Estela Ben-Simon. She thinks about equity-mindedness, and equity-mindedness will require you to break down the numbers in very discrete ways so that you can really determine where is equity happening, right? Where is there equity and where isn't there? So that's why I put that there. Your outcomes are pretty good. I put a comparison here. So speaking of Dr. Ben-Simon's work, she talks a lot about equitable outcomes for Latino students at HSIs. Right? She was one of the first to say, well, the numbers aren't equitable. If you're not graduating Latino students in equitable numbers to your white students, you're not an HSI, right? So when you start to break down those numbers, you're like, okay, let me see, are we equitable? As opposed to masking all the numbers. And your numbers are pretty equitable, actually, right? Your Latino students versus your white students, or any populations you want to compare there. You got to keep in mind that some of those are small numbers, right? Like your Native population. Those are kind of skewed, I think, because the numbers are so small. So keep that in mind, but I didn't want to cut them out completely. But then I put the average also, right? So HSIs on average, their 6-year graduation rate on average is 39% for all students. And for all post-secondary institutions, it's 59%, right? So you're falling at much closer to the national average, right? Which is important. So you got to break it all down, right? Like, that's pretty much my argument always. Is like, you look at the data in multiple ways, shift it, turn it. What does equity mean? What does equity mean for y'all? But equity would be the goal for outcomes, right? Now, culture. So I do a quick analysis. Y'all could definitely tell me what else you got going on here, but this is some of the things I found, like when I think about, well, where typically students, the research will tell us that students feel like they belong in places like cultural centers or student organizations or their particular group. Or like student support services, TRIO, Upper Bound, places like that where they're gonna more likely see themselves, that's where they're more likely to feel a sense of belonging, right? So I always look for those sort of things on a website, like a quick, like, okay, well, what does the culture look like? Are there spaces even there, right? Do you have the spaces to support students? And these are a couple of the things that I found. I could definitely be missing a lot, so it was a quick search of your website, but something to think about is like, where are the spaces where students feel like they belong, and how do you move those up? How do you scale those spaces up, right? And that's what I'm gonna talk about in the workshop, is scaling small spaces into large spaces. How do you scale up a TRIO program that only serves 1,200 students to serve all 35,000 students, right? How do you scale that up? Because that's when you will push towards being more effectively serving students in the cultural realm. So I think that's it, and then I'll go ahead and give you all time for questions. Did you want to take the mic so people can ask?
Does anyone have a question for Dr. Garcia? Seems like our thoughts were synced, because that's exactly what I was asking them when we came in.
Okay.
What does it mean to be a Hispanic serving institution? Is it just enrollment numbers, or is it how we serve our students and our faculty and staff? So that was on point. Thank you.
Okay.
If there's no questions, she will be facilitating a workshop during our morning breakout sessions. So please stop by her workshop. I believe you're in Live Oak D, if I'm not mistaken. C. Live Oak C. Thank you, Dr. Garcia. Thank you. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Andres Ramirez, Assistant Professor in the Curriculum, Culture, and Educational Inquiry Department, and Dr. Maria Vasquez, Assistant Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Research Methodology, to share information regarding the Hispanic Serving Institution Research Interest Group and how you can get involved. Dr. Ramirez will also moderate today's panel discussion titled The Fabric of Latinx.
Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Great. Thank you, Dr. Garcia, for an inspiring presentation. We're hoping to continue the conversation in the months to come. If everybody's trying to figure out what to do, so then we'll do us. That's important. We'll try to learn from our culture, from what we have at FAU, the limitations, but also the strengths. And as you can see, we have wonderful people around us. Dr. Maria Vasquez is, we are co-chairing the Hispanic Serving Institution Research Group, which is supported by the Division of Research. So we have that institutional backup. It was convened by Dr. Karen Scarpinato from the Division of Research, and later on we took it upon ourselves to begin to build a vision and to begin to build what we want to do with the Hispanic Research, Hispanic Institution Research Group. We are very interested in continuing the path, and actually we are making the path as we speak. So Dr. Garcia's remarks come at a great time, and there's a lot of literature that we are actually looking on, but we are beginning with our own data and with our own specific. Before telling you a little bit about the vision and the mission of the research group, I want to provide the opportunity to Dr. Vasquez to just also say a little more words and just welcome you.
And I will need to lower the microphone. Good morning, everybody. How How are you? I should say also buenos dias, which is also good morning, just to be in that tone of the topic. I'm Maria Vasquez Colina, Associate Professor in the College of Education, Department of Leadership and Research Methodology. And this is a very exciting moment for us. Thank you, Dr. Garcia, for your words. And as we were listening to what Dr. Garcia was saying, one of the things I came up with based on the information presented was the definition of what is Hispanic served in this institution is personalized, right? So we don't use parameters, we don't measure, we don't use a scale, but it's personalized. Who we are is who we are, and we want to become who we are. So that's something we are learning to do, and in our group, faculty, staff, research, interest group, that's what we are trying to do. We are gathering information, learning from FAU, institutional data, about colleges. How do we look in each of the College of Medicine, College of Education? What about differences between gender, female and males, existing students? We are learning how we are looking, and it's really exciting. With Andres, we are getting very excited. Perhaps too much excitement sometimes, it's not good, but definitely the motivation is there. So thank you very much for being here, and we will be sending more information about our group, and we would like to hear from you, at least see if there's interest. Thank you.
Okay, so I was telling you that that the Division of Research initially convened this group, and some of the members on that initial group are Dr. Cristobal Salinas from Educational Leadership, he's right here, Dr. John Harman, Augie Marquez from Computer and Electrical Engineering, Maria Petri from Computer Science, Eric Enenberg from Ocean and Mechanical Engineering, Monica Rosselli from Psychology, Corey Carabina from Math, Maria Vasquez, Andrea Guzman Oliver, Susan Day from Department of the Division of Research, and some other interested faculty include, or staff include Adiel Gomez, Jose de la Garza Valenzuela, Marianne Gosden from Language, Literacy and Comparative Literature, and Nora Erro Peralta. We would, and of course, we have Liz Bocassette from Student Abroad and Global Services. Did I say that correctly? So, yes, I'm sorry. The mission and purpose of the group is the Hispanic Served Institution Interest Group promotes research and educational and leadership opportunities for FAU faculty and students that focus on Latinx success in higher education. This group is co-directed by myself, Andres Ramirez, and Dr. Maria Vasquez, Associate Professor in the College of Education. Participants include representatives from the College of Education, College of Engineering, as I just read. We are looking for more associates that would like to collaborate with us. And we are launching, hopefully in next week's, the next 2 weeks or so, our website, in which you will have a lot of annotated bibliography, literature there. Hopefully we could have also some presentations, for example, Dr. Garcia, if she allows us to put some of that there. And also, we would actually have a specific line of to ask questions when you are writing a grant, or when you're thinking about any kind of data that you need specifically to FAU or nationally. Our website in the FAU for the Hispanic Service Institution can be that resource for you to go first. If we don't know, we want to know. And your question will actually enhance our possibility of channeling, because as Dr. Garcia said, we need to make our own path. And that's what we're trying to do. Those questions that you're interested in, we want to research them, to help you research them. So that's one of the ideas with the group. I think that's all, and thank you very much. One last thing, I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Denise Corbin, who's the chair of my department, Curriculum, Culture, and Educational Inquiry, for allowing us to work on this in our department, and to hosting the intern that we got from the Office of Internship. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. So there's a lot of opportunities for you to get involved. If you're interested in getting involved with any research or grant opportunities to better serve our Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx populations, please do reach out to Andres. There's also opportunities within our diversity platform. At this time, we're going to move forward with the panel discussion. So I'd like to invite Dr. Garcia back up to the stage. And I would also like to ask Dr. Cristobal Salinas, Assistant Professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Research Methodology, to join us, and Dr. Jose de la Garza Valenzuela, Assistant Professor in the Department of English. Today's panel discussion is entitled The Fabric of Latinx. So we've heard this term sort of floating around. How many individuals in the room have never heard the term Latinx? Okay, so there are some that have not heard the term just yet. So this panel will help answer some of these questions. What is Latinx? What does that mean? Where did it evolve from? What kind of research is being conducted in this area? What kind of research is being conducted right here at FAU? We have a nationally renowned author here that does research in Latinx. Actually, we have two. So we're very fortunate to have folks right here in FAU that are doing this type of research. So the first question is, you've all written on the Latinx experience. What exactly is Latinx, and how did this term emerge?
Buenos dias, good morning everyone. So I'll start. Cristobal Salinas, assistant professor here at Florida Atlantic University. So I struggled with the term Latinx at the beginning because of being a Spanish speaker, growing up in Mexico, and really understanding how I grew up in a male-centric community, right? And how the language is very male-centric. And this is unfortunate to say, but it makes sense, the term Latinx, during Pulse shooting. And that makes sense because there were so many people that died that we did not know their gender, their sexual orientation, and or their undocumented status, right? And they were not out to their families and all these things. So that's when it clicked on me. That's like, oh, that is what Latinx is, right? I struggled for the longest longest time, and really trying to understand what Latinx means. And then, one of my most recent articles describes and looks. I tried, with my co-author Adel Lozano, we tried to recontextualize that term and give context to that term Latinx in higher education, right? But in our research shows that the term started being used in 2014 at University of Columbia by students of the Mexican American Association, where they wanted to be inclusive of other communities that did not identify with that gender, with any male or female. So for those individuals that identify with that spectrum of gender, that was more inclusive. So for the Latino Hispanic Heritage Month, they changed to Latinx. And that's how it started to use, and it got a lot of attention inside higher ed. And now I'm speaking to that in the higher education, college and universities context. There's more research in terms of sociology, and there's more research on other anthropology and other areas. And we look at the literature review, but we like to believe that it's our first article that really recontextualized the term Latinx in higher education. So we look at all the conferences in higher education, that how they use the term. In 2014, there was no one. 2015, no one used the term. In 2016, a few of them. In 2018, 2019, everyone's using the term Latinx. And then we look at HSIs, that are Big 10 universities, how they're using the term Latinx. So no one is using it. Students are using it, let me rephrase that, right? But in terms when it comes to who has institutionalized the term, no one has. But that's the beauty of the term. that it is the power of language. We create language to give voice to our stories, to our social identities, and we are making us, right? We're learning from ourselves and so on. So to give the opportunity to the other panelists in the sense of making sense how it's being used, it is a term that it is used, how we define it, it is an inclusive term that recognizes the intersectionality of sexuality, language, migration, ethnicity, culture, and phenotype. While there's various definitions of Latinx, once again, we argue in our paper that the term Latinx was formed to create a liberation for trans people. Now, we also make the argument that people that refer to use that term, it is because they have inner feelings towards transphobia or homophobia. Because they do not want, not that they don't want to, but there's a lot of homophobia and transphobia still. So we make the argument that this term, people do not use it because transphobic feelings. The other thing that we discover is, but we make the argument is that this term, it is influenced by indigenous communities from Mexico. We found that in Mexico, in Oaxaca, there are 2 towns that they have a 3rd gender. In that, having a 3rd gender, it is a privilege in their families. And that is the muches. So that, and they use the X as well and so on. So we make that reference that the X on Latinx, it is influenced by indigenous communities. Because having a Latinx or a muche in these communities, it is a privilege. That doesn't mean they are trans. That doesn't mean that they are gay, bi, or and so on. But it is a muche. It's a separate gender in these communities. And thinking about how I grew up in Mexico and so on, how these communities have been very, either you're male or female, and that really was enlightening for me and so on. So in how I use that term, I try to be inclusive in the sense of the term Latinx tries to cover the A and the O to be inclusive, but there's still a lot of people that do not want to use Latinx. But also in the research, I'm very careful that when I'm speaking about Latino males, I use Latino males, Latino, right? Because I do not know how they self-identify these males. And there's a lot of, as I work with my colleagues or I review other peer review articles or research in other manuscripts, is people still misuse it. The other thing that I've been being critical in the sense of how people use that term on Latinx and fraternity and sorority organizations. While we do have trans students in fraternity and sororities, there's still, these fraternities and sororities, these institutions, organizations, are not inclusive of trans students. Because if we look at the history of fraternity and sororities, they haven't been inclusive of trans people and so on, but we can keep going, and I just want to allow the opportunity.
I'm just gonna say ditto. That was all. If you haven't read the article yet, read the article. The article is really good and helps. I know I struggled with the term initially as well, because I didn't want to be like a scholar that just jumps on like the trendiest word, right? And it did become real trendy real fast, particularly in education research. But for me, it is an important way to recognize gender, people who identify, don't identify with one gender, or they're gender non-binary folks, gender is fluid, right? So those of you that are in the room that value that and recognize that and that support your students and your faculty and your staff, because folks on campus who are gender non-binary folks, that's a good way to recognize them, right? And it's small. I know for me, I'm still trying to figure out what does it mean to support transgender students or gender non-binary students. And it's one thing, right? Language matters. It's just one thing, right? There's many other things you can be doing on your campus, but language matters to people, right? And that's why I think the debate, because there definitely is a debate, and you can find articles that will argue against it, right? That Latinx or Latino or Chicano or whoever they're going to identify, people have written against using it. So read about the debate. There's definitely a lot of interesting points being made, but yeah, definitely read that article.
I arrived at the term very differently. I'm Jose from the Department of English, and I think the idea for me was emerging from a social media kind of standpoint, right? This doesn't come particularly from the institution. This is actually kind of a grassroots emergence of the term. And the use of X kind of to signify difference is not something that's new either, right? You know, like Chicanos have been using the X at the beginning and at the end, and so this is something that has a history. And so part of the reason why I think it's very important to consider where the term comes from, right, that it comes from students, is that that is not the first instance where Latinx students are actually trying to make strides within university spaces. In the turn of the 60s, 70s, right, there is a moment during the Chicano movement, right, where it's students leading, right, particular kinds of claims to have ethnic studies in universities, and that's exactly why we have something like this happening now, right? And so this is like 40 years of student activism in the making, and part of what I think they're demanding is that we understand the diversity of the Latino experience both within and outside of universities. Right, and so it's not just about, and I think Latinx kind of speaks to that, right, being more inclusive of transgender students, but also kind of like realizing ourselves that these categories aren't sufficient, right? And so rather than jumping on board with a term, right, these terms are constantly in flux. And so it might be Latinx this year, and it's okay if it's not next year, right? There is this kind of drive to reimagine how we fit into a grander narrative. And I think that's what students are really seeking out, finding words to describe how they fit into a narrative of American, US kind of US identity, specifically in these kinds of very stressful cultural and political legal times, right? And so that's really where I think this is rooted, and it's not driven by us, right? This is driven by the students and people online themselves, right? So it's not us old folks, it's them.
Thank you. So a couple takeaways. The Spanish language is a gendered language. If it ends with an A, it means female. If it ends with an O, it means male. So the students came up with Latinx to self-identify, to self-define themselves. This is important for us because if we're here to serve our students, we need to know what are they comfortable with. I struggle with a lot of the terminologies. I don't like labels. Personally, I think everyone should just be American and we would eliminate a lot of issues. But that's not the society that we live in. So to be safe, you just ask, how do you identify? What do you prefer to be identified as? And allow that person to share their story with you. So the next question, can you briefly share a little bit about your research and your findings thus far, and what your findings say or speak to our institution? What kind of changes should we be looking to make?
So pulling the microphone, I'll start. My research is principally on legal studies and their intersection with literary studies. And that's part of why I think about this as a continuity of a conversation that's been happening for 50 years, right? That this is not the first time that students and Latinx communities kind of engage with particular kind of legal cultural affronts, right? This is again a 50, 60-year-old legacy of kind of being targeted. And so to some degree, my research involves looking at gender, looking at how citizenship itself becomes this kind of structure that we think about as the ideal, right? That we arrive at citizenship, and citizenship gives us some access to things or to certain communities, and that's not really the case, right? You know, citizenship is always conditional. And part of my interest is thinking about how queer Chicano men specifically think about the conditions of their citizenship. And so, and that, then bridges into questions of trans identity, bridges into questions of legality, right? Because, for instance, things like immigration is tied to queerness insofar as people used to be deported for being queer after they had already been granted entry, right? And so the relationship that people have to terms, right? And the relationship that people have to certain kinds of legal understandings of themselves, right, is very, very complicated. And so one of the guiding questions for me, especially in my research on Latinx identity, is how do you understand yourself when the only time that you're represented is in these criminalized discourses, right? So if we understand you only as criminal in the law and we don't represent you elsewhere, then how do you engage with those elements of representation, right? How do you confront a world, right, that by design is telling you on a constant and irregular basis that you are not to understand yourself outside of certain categories, such as criminality and documentedness, right? Things like that. And so that's kind of how I think it's, again, very important to consider how Latinx comes to signify how diverse the communities are internally, right? It's not a monolithic group, right? And so if anything, it's inviting us to consider what are the ways that we don't understand, right, Latino identity, and the students are saying we have answers, right? And so more than just like institutional work, like we have to really listen to our students, right? In my class this semester, I'm teaching a Latina Latinx studies class, and out of 20 students, right, more than half had not read a text by a Latino writer, right? And most of the students were from New York, from Miami, right, or from Chicago, right? Like, and those are very prominently Latino spaces, right, where high school should be teaching certain courses. I grew up in Houston. We were taught Sanderson scenarios at the very least, right? And so it's important to consider what they're arriving at. They're trying to figure out how they fit into these kinds of narratives, right? So I think it's mostly about listening to them and thinking about how our research can respond to the kinds of questions that they have, right, that we're not quite considering yet.
So my scholarship and my work, I mean, y'all had heard a little snippet, gets to the organizational level, right? So the conversation as far as identity is at a different level, right? So I have thought a lot about individual identities and Latinx identities and gender identities or different types of student identities, because that's like my training and background. I have like a degree in college student personnel, and we do a lot of that, right? Those of you that have been through programs in higher ed, we do a lot of that, trying to understand students. And so what I do in my work is go to the next level and look at it at an organizational level. And that's super complex because an organizational identity is made up of a lot of individual identities, right? So all of you, what I argue at an organizational level, you all, everybody in the room gets to give and contribute to the organizational identity, right? There should be a point at which everybody in the room, if I ask everybody in the room, what does it mean to be Latinx serving, an institution that is Latinx serving, that you all sort of give me the same answer, right? Because you all agree, right? You all agree that this is who we are, what we do, right? That's not happening, I'll tell you, right? Like I do a lot of like, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And believe me, there's a whole bunch of things, right? Lots and lots of things, which obviously there's, you know, it's a large campus. Campuses are large and they're complex and they're siloed and there's all these ways in which we're compartmentalized. And so of course we don't always have a dominant narrative, but I think that's what the point of today is, right? Is to get to this more like a narrative where we all agree, this is what Latinx serving looks like, right? But yeah, so that's where my work is a little different, right? And that it's at the organizational level, right? So it's complicated because now you got to think about what are students' individual identities, what is everybody's in the room identity, what are your faculty, your administrators, your staff, everybody's identities, their individual identities, how are they defining themselves? Allowing them to define themselves, allowing them to say, I'm Latinx, or I'm Chicana, or whatever, right? There's so many terms people could be, or American, right? Like everyone's gonna decide what they wanna be, and then taking that to the next level, right? Okay, now how do we serve all those people? Now that there's 50 people in the room and you all have a different identity, how do we come to serve all of you, right? And I'm gonna say all of you because I think a Latinx serving institution should serve your faculty and your staff as well, right? That's where we should be. Right, that we're serving everybody, right? We all feel like we belong here. We all are working towards the same productive goal, whatever that goal or those outcomes are that we want to have as an institution. So I think that's where my research gets, it's a little different in that it's complicated because it's at an organizational level. But I do think it's constructed, and so I do think that everybody should have that opportunity to contribute to the narrative and to contribute to the construction of an organizational identity.
So in terms of how do I look at identities and so on, right? I think we all do have all identities. Do I agree that all of us are American? Yes, in a sense, but I'm gonna disagree with that statement because of, I understand that yes, I'm American, yeah, I'm Latino, I'm a brown Latino, right? In the sense of, I wanna make sure that, I don't wanna talk nice to you, sorry. But I'm close to Gina, so I feel like I could, but I will not because I don't want to make sure that when we step outside of this room, that we continue to do that, right? In the sense of, as a Latino, I want to make sure that they acknowledge that I'm Latino and that I have my own lived experiences, my own social identities as a gay Latino male with an accent and a young faculty, right? What does that mean? Because when I enter spaces, and even on campus here, oftentimes I get confused by a student. And some of you, I've been hearing this, that I engage in this space, that are here, I walked in and not that I want that respect, but like that how you treat students is how you treat me. But once some of the people that are sitting in this room, when you find that I'm faculty, everything changes, right? But is it because I'm Latino, is it because I'm look young, or is it because of the title? Right, so I think about how do we self-identify ourselves. It is, I look at a social identity and try to understand and hear the stories. In the sense of also I look about gender, right? I'm not gonna say that I don't look at gender, that we're all equal, that we're all humans. Yes, we're all humans, but also there's women's rights, right? Because women have been historically marginalized and so on. So I want to make sure that I understand and I continue to push equity for them, right? Because I, as a male privilege, and people often tend to ask me, how do you are so successful? How do you do this? And I do acknowledge that, well, I am single and I'm a male. And because I'm a male, I've been able to get more opportunities granted by my white male faculty than my female colleagues, regardless of the gender, right? So in my research shows that, in my dissertation in particular, I studied like the socialization of Latinos in education. And all of them said, well, I have this framework, blah, 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 but they said, I understand that since I was in graduate school in the master's or PhD, I was invited to do grant writing, to do more research than my female colleagues. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge that, right? So, but because I'm assistant professor in my research, I like to think it's it's everywhere in the sense of how I make sense of my research. I look at how historically marginalized communities experience the three levels of oppression at the institutional, cultural, and individual level. So to give context to that, at the institutional level, I study community college, my first books in community colleges, and my current ongoing data is on men of color at community colleges. And when I say men of color, I want to make sure that it is, to be clear, that it's only on Latino and Black, right? And then at the institutional level, that's institutional level, at the cultural level, I study, my book that comes out in May, I'm super excited, is on hazing. It is on a comprehensive study on hazing in college and universities that studies fraternities and sororities, marching bands, athletics, and military. But I study these communities because there's not a lot of research on individuals that are being hazed. And literature review targets and oppresses Black communities because there's literature that says Black fraternities and sororities are the ones that haze the most. I was like, no. So I make the argument that hazing is not a Black problem, it is a human problem. So that's part of how this community has been oppressed. And also, I think about a cultural, I write about linguistics in the sense of like, I like to write in Spanish and not translate it. My other article that I published in a peer review article, it was published in October somewhere, I don't know. I write a poem in Spanish and I do not translate it. It was rejected first, but then they came back to me, the editors, and like, oh, we'll publish it. But if you change the term Latino, Latina to Latinx. Like, of course I want that because I'm in tenure, I need publications. But in terms of the cultural, but that's problematic itself, right? Because it's very problematic, and I understand that, but also, now that I understand the term, I'm glad I did that. Because it gives voices to those communities that they haven't been heard. At the individual level, Latino males, Black males, and then I have some of my PhD students here, we have a paper coming out on the role of spirituality for Black males at community colleges. We didn't ask anything on the spirituality. All these Black men start to talk about how God and Jesus has helped them overcome their challenges. Even then, some of the students in the career path, they said, I am going into criminal justice because police brutality. I'm going into criminal justice because my brother is a victim of police brutality. So they want to change the system because the system is against them. And they even said, I always have to watch my back because my professor's always looking at me or stereotyping me, not always, but sometimes. My classmates sometimes will make racist comments. And then even one of the students said, even God is always looking at me. So I always have to watch my back, how I behave and how I interact in every space. And most recently, I just finished a study on Muslim males at college and universities, and how do they engage in the classroom and outside the classroom based on the current political era.
Thank you. So Dr. Salinas and I have something very much in common. My research is also in a community college setting regarding perceptions of standard and non-standard English, specifically with women of color, Hispanic and Black primarily. So let me restate what I said. I don't like labels. Why can't we all be just American? Dr. De La Varga explained it very well. He said citizenship is conditional. It's conditional. And that condition is determined by our society. That's why we can't all just be American. Because the issues aren't going to go away if society and government can determine our citizenship. So we're poised to make change in research. We're poised as an institution to really study those organizational cultures that Dr. Garcia has spoken about, those subcultures that exist within the main culture, and really peel away that onion to figure out what is our identity, what do we actually stand for as an institution of higher ed. I'm going to forego my third question so that I can give you an opportunity to ask questions of our panel. Any questions?
I can go.
You're on the panel.
That's okay, I can run.
Yes. You haven't heard it yet, but anyways.
I want to go back to the term Latinx, because I know that a lot of people still struggle with it for different reasons, and some of them that we didn't get a chance to talk about. I also work with NASPA as the Region 3 Latino, Latina, Latinx outgoing representative. And one of the struggles that we have is, when Latin does not have a gender, just the word Latin. Latinx obviously brings more to the table. A lot of us stop using Latin and use Latino and Latina because that's how we felt we wanted to be represented. And again, because of language. The Latino and Latina brings it back home more. And it was a term of pride. For us, Latina sisters also was a term of pride also in gender, in taking back the fact that we're proud Latinas. I don't know if the term Latinx, anybody has ever talked about calling Latinx, even though it's a little more wordsome? Or how do we struggle with the fact that part of the reason why we love the Latino, Latina was because it had the Spanish and it brought it home. Latinx doesn't bring it home as much in some ways because of that, even though it brings something else to the table.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I think so there are two things that I think are interesting that I can add to this. So I think that Latinx does invite disagreement, and I think that that's part of the politics of that, right? And I think that part of it is having to reorganize our own fitting in, right? So think about the idea of like trans communities not necessarily fitting in, and now the pressure is being put on us to think about how we reconcile our own Latino, Latina-ness, right? Into this kind of category. And because that was kind of partly why I had a vexed relationship with it at first. I was like, especially with like trans sisters, right? I'm like, well, they've spent so much time and like so many generations affirming their like Latina-ness, right? That to some degree, is there some kind of complicated sense of like what X might do to like their own kind of trajectory and journey, right? And I think that it does kind of have a generational divide. But I think something that spoke to me in your comment was the question of home, right? And I think that for many of us, right, feeling at home or bringing it home is not really a familiar feeling. And I think that partly that's what Latinx does, that it says like, what does home mean, right? What can we bring home? And like, how do we find ourselves fitting into these kinds of like structures, right? And so like, does it bring it home? No, but that might be exactly why it is actually a productive kind of like term, right? It kind of like invites us to place ourselves at the margins of our own communities and think about what they're contributing and giving it that space, bringing the term to the center, right, in some ways, and reassessing how we relate to it in certain ways.
To add to that, Riaz, really quick, and I think Jose said it earlier in the sense of how we're living in society is changing and we're changing, terminology changes, right? So as we look at the history of Latinx or Latino, Latina, you know, that's another example of how Latinos, Latinx, Latinas, we are making a change in institutions. Because if you look at the history in terms, it used to be Latin, what you said, right? And then as more Latinos have continued to emerge, and not emerge, but we've always been here, right? And we will continue to be here. As Gina said, even if there's a wall, we're going to continue to grow, right? That terminology is still going to change, it's going to make a difference. So to make my point is that if we look at the history of how in literature review has been used, it was on Latin, like, you know, because that's English, like Latin, because of the high influence, of the influence of Latino, Latinas, Latinx in the United States and also in education, it started to change, right, to Latino, and then Latina, Latina, and then we see also the term of Latinat, right, like the at sign. So we as scholars have the responsibility of making sure that we use this appropriately. Because, and this is, you know, we use it so freely, and no one yet has done research on people that self-identify as Latinx. How and why they came to understand this. So I don't know if I can answer your question in the sense like, what does it mean to go home, right? And I think about it, how do I explain to my parents Latinx? How do I translate this? It doesn't translate, right? Because it does not translate. But also that's that problem in academia, because 78% of the scholarship that we publish in the world is in English. And all the terminology, most of the terminology that we have in social justice, inclusion, diversity, it does not translate into Spanish either, or other languages. So that is why in my scholarship I try to write in Spanish to give context to some of these terms that we can't use. And I think Latinx, it is a term that has evolved as well as a form of creating that liberation that no one else has given us a term, or we haven't created a term that we can express or translate our realities. So with that, and I mean, I can keep going on. And then also social media has played a significant role. In our study, we look at how the term Latinx is being used in social media. And we noticed that in Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, females are more likely to use it. Once again, in social media, you can only use male or female, that's it. But females are more likely to use it. And then it was mostly in the United States. Other countries like Spain and Argentina use that term, but where they're from tourists that went from here to those countries that were using the term Latinx.
Dr. Garcia, I have a question for you. In your studies of Latinx serving institutions, what have you encountered in terms of institutional barriers towards this? And I'm asking because it seems that there is an energy in the room here for us to move forward on something. Is there anything for which we need to be prepared?
Yes, there's lots and lots of barriers, right? And I'm sure y'all have already, those of you that are working specifically on the committee and thinking about this more have already come to them. I think the biggest tensions that people talk about, like because I do a lot of qualitative research and just talk to folks, one of the biggest tensions I've seen is between administration and faculty and staff, right? That like administration wants one thing and then faculty want another and staff want another, right? And the interesting thing is, for the next study that I'm actually going to do, I'm doing participatory action research methods and bringing students in, because students don't often get to define this. I don't know how many students are in the room, but I'm just going to say it doesn't look like a lot of students. I don't know if you know, right? Unless some of y'all are also students, but in addition to your roles on campus, but students are largely left out of defining that, right? And so there's tensions, and like the administration wants one thing, and faculty want another thing, and staff want another thing, and then students are like, what are you talking about? They don't even know what HSI is, right? And I wrote about that, and then I talked to students, and they're like, I don't know, it could mean this or it could mean that. I have no idea what an HSI is. I just like it here because it's fun. I like it here because there's people that look like me. I like it here because X, Y, Z. I don't know what this identity is, right? And they could care less, right? They just know what they enjoy about the institution, right? There's other things for them that define what that means to be an HSI. And so I think there's lots and lots of tensions between groups. So I would say, if you're thinking about where the tension's gonna be, that would be one. Another one where I would say the barriers is, how do you get students involved in this conversation, right? And get them to start thinking about what it means. I don't think they have to know that it's an HSI for it to be an HSI. That would definitely that's an important thing, right? You don't have to know that you're attending an HSI for it actually to feel like it is an HSI.
Thank you. So we don't have that many students here, but if you are a student in the room, can you please stand? We have a couple. The symposium is specific for faculty and staff. This Saturday is the Student We Lead Diversity Symposium, and I have the honor of doing the welcome. So we're going to find out.
Okay.
What do students want?
Okay. Thank you, students, for being
So thank you for that.
Good morning, everyone. Ashley Williams. So a quick question for any of you. So I know that when I learned that we were at HSI, I was like, oh my gosh, we're at HSI, wow. What does that mean? And I also asked the question, like, does that mean our numbers, or does that mean how we serve? And so I know that there are different ways in looking at this. Like, you do have the organizational lens, you have the academic lens, but I think, speaking as a student affairs professional, the question that I have is, how do we consider serving our students through our programs? And what does that look like as it pertains to collaboration? Like, what are some practical suggestions that we can be intentional on or focus on in reference to what we produce?
Right. I think that.
So I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just gonna plug the workshop after this. I'm gonna talk about that. She's like, darn it, they're like, darn it. No, I think that student services needs to be a part of it. I think that's part of being the culture. But the reality is every single aspect of the university, we need to be thinking about this, right? And that's what I'm gonna talk about in the workshop is like, how do you change your curriculum, right? How do you make it so that students get to actually read Latino authors, right? Because that's true. They get to college, they're 20 years old and have never read a Latino author in their whole life, right? How does that happen? We've failed them at the K through 12 level, right? Students have been largely failed. Latinx students have been largely failed, right? So how do we make up for that, right? And recognize that they've been largely failed and make up for that, right? And make sure that they feel and hear their voices within the classroom and within their programs, right? So I think it needs to happen curricular and co-curricular. And I have a student affairs background, so that's why I think, yeah, absolutely needs to happen at the co-curricular background. So, but yeah, hopefully I'll see you in there. But if not, come talk to me, I'll give you some ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. I have to agree. I believe that education, it's funny because we think of education as forever evolving, yet for whatever reason, we stay within the same methodologies. Like we teach everything the same way. So students learn through one lens, and we learn to teach students through one lens. It isn't until you start to look at things from a critical race perspective that you then find the intersection. So Dr. Garcia will teach you how to think about that through a critical race lens so that you can then create programs inside and outside of the classroom that truly speak to our students. Please thank our panelists for sharing their research with us and for teaching us about the fabric of Latinx.